All right, so we're so happy today that we have Dr. Judy Gaughan here. And done a lot of work here with many different things, but Dr. Judy Gaughan is the Associate Professor of History at the Colorado State University in Pueblo and is one of the organizers of the Women's Suffrage Centennial Southern Colorado, a valued partner in the Women's Vote Centennial Colorado this year in 2020. Dr. Judy Gaughan is currently writing a book, Surely the World Moves, Carrie Clyde Holly and American First. Thank you, Dr. Judy Gaughan, for taking the time to be with us today to tell about this remarkable story.
Thanks, Mike. First, I wanted to say thank you to Mike Erickson and Jillian Allison and to History Colorado, and especially the Center for Colorado Women's History, for hosting really what's been a fascinating lecture series. Hopefully it will continue to be fascinating today. I just also wanted to give a little warning that there's a trigger topic in this talk. Holly passed legislation on statutory rape, so I will be talking about that later in this talk, and I just wanted people to be aware of that ahead of time. So, in February 2018, as I was happily strolling the streets of ancient Rome, metaphorically speaking, I joined with 16 other women to create an organization to celebrate the centennial of national women's suffrage. At the first meeting of the soon-to-be-named Women's Suffrage Centennial Southern Colorado, I first learned that Pueblo had an early stateswoman. The significance of this did not strike me immediately, but as I began to do research to celebrate Colorado's quasquicentennial, that is 125 years of women in Colorado having the right to vote, 27 years before the nation, as I started to do more studying about that, I got more and more intrigued by the person of Carrie Clyde Holly. And in particular, I was intrigued by the notion that almost no one in the country, including people in Pueblo, had ever heard of her, had ever heard of the first woman in the history of the United States to pass a law or to get a law passed. So I left the streets of ancient Rome, or more accurately, I walked down two different streets of the past, one in ancient Rome and the other in the 19th century in Pueblo, Colorado. I decided Carrie Clyde Holly's story needed to be told, and so I'm writing a book about her. Today, I intend to share with you some of what I have discovered. First, a little outline, because I am a professor and I know students like outlines, and so I'm assuming you do as well. So I'm going to start by talking about a few of her colleagues in office, and then what little we know of her early life, the Colorado suffrage vote of 1893, the campaign of 1894, and then I'm going to talk about a few different things during the legislative session. I'm going to spend most of my time there and on the bill that passed, and also on some of the struggles to get her bill passed, and some of the sexism, that she faced. Then I will talk about her life after her year in office as a lawyer, a stateswoman, and a suffragist. Then I want to talk about her impact and her reputation. So let's start with her colleagues in office. First, we could turn to Clara Cressingham. So Clara Cressingham was elected in what was then Arapahoe County, and that was the city of Denver was part of Arapahoe County in those days. So Clara Cressingham's interest in governing was to take on a leadership role. She became secretary of the Republican caucus. She tried to pass legislation on labor mediation and a bounty law for the sugar beet industry. Colorado was just beginning to plant sugar beets, and it was a relatively lucrative crop, and she wanted to ensure its success. That bill actually passed the House and Senate, but it was vetoed by the governor. She also claimed to not be interested in what she referred to as sentimental legislation. And I will talk with you in a moment about what we're talking about when we're talking about sentimental legislation. Also that same year, Frances S. Clark was elected in Denver, in the city of Denver. And she was active in the Women's Auxiliary of the Grand Army of the Republic. This was a Civil War veteran support group. well, supporting Union officers anyway. And they'd probably be happy with the tearing down of Confederate statues. So she's a member of the Women's Auxiliary of the Grand Army of the Republic. And one newspaper actually credits her win to the vote of the soldiers. She chaired the Committee on Military and Indian Affairs in the House of Representatives, and she tried to get the state to fund a reformatory school for girls and young women. This was known as the State Industrial School. The legislature had already passed and created a school, but had not provided any funding for it. And so she was trying to get that funded. Her bills did not pass the General Assembly. Finally, I want to take just a moment to mention Joseph Stewart. For the women, this was the first time women were in office. This was not the case for Black men. Joseph Stewart was not the first Black man in the Colorado State Legislature. That honor goes to John Gaughan in 1881, before women in Colorado could vote, but 11 years after the 15th Amendment to the US Constitution that forbade race, color, or previous condition of servitude to be used to prevent voting. The reason I'm including Joseph Stewart here is that his agenda in protecting the rights of Black people parallels Holly's agenda in protecting the rights of women. Legislatively speaking, Holly seems to have had more in common with him than with her colleagues who were women. What do you know? Not all women were alike. Stewart, like Holly, had one of his bills become a law. Basically, it made it illegal to exclude colored persons from hotels or theaters, and there was a fine attached to it if you did. He also, like Holly, promulgated several important bills that did not pass. And this included a bill on miscegenation, intermarriage of different races, and also on forbidding extortion and discrimination in disseminating telegraphs. Apparently, if you were Black, you had to pay more money to get your telegraph than if you were white. So he was active in civil rights in the same way that Holly was active in civil rights, only we call them women's rights. So let's turn to Holly herself. Carrie Clyde Holly was born in New York City and grew up the eldest of 7 children in Stamford, Connecticut. Pictured here is not the Holt family. No one had cell phones, so there are no selfies, and very few people even had cameras. So there are no pictures of, at least as far as I know yet, of the Holt family. But these are pictures from the 19th century. And probably pictures of people who were a bit wealthier than the Holts, although they were upper middle class at least. Carrie Holt's father was a lawyer, and he was descended on his mother's side from Samuel Clyde, a Revolutionary War hero, who even had a fort named after him. I suspect Carrie was proud of this heritage as she maintained use of the Clyde name all her life. Her mother was Maria Fanning. We don't actually know a lot about her upbringing. The plan was to go to the archives in Stamford, but there is this global pandemic that has hindered some of my research plans. So hopefully next summer I will make it to Stamford, Connecticut, and to a few other places where Holly lived, and get a chance to look at archives and maybe find more information, because we don't have much personal information about Carrie Clyde Holly. But as I said, they were a family of some wealth, always having one live-in maid. You can see here in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. Again, not the actual maid who was there, just a facsimile. Around 1881, Carrie Holt married Charles Frederick Holly, who had served as a territorial legislator in Colorado in 1861 and 1862, and had served as a Supreme Court justice in the state of Colorado. At the time of the marriage, he was working as a lawyer in New York City, probably for a company based in Pueblo. Carrie was his second wife. He had several other children, including a son who was her age. At the time of their marriage, she was 25 and he was 63. Together, they had 2 daughters, Emily, born in 1883, and Helen, born in 1887. There may actually have been 2 additional children born either on the East Coast or in Pueblo, but they did not survive childhood. One of the state censuses asks the question, how many living children do you have and how many children have you had? And so the number there was 4 and 2. But primarily, Carrie Clyde Holly raised 2 daughters, Emily and Helen. Sometime around 1889, the Hollys moved to Pueblo, Colorado. She probably took one of these train routes you see here on the screen. Don't know which one, but almost certainly took a train from the East Coast to Pueblo. And they settled on a ranch or possibly a fruit orchard in Vineland in Pueblo County. Here, Holly wrote poetry, raised her 2 daughters, and eventually took on a leadership role by serving on the school district in Vineland. And after she was elected to the school district in Vineland, she was elected by other members of the school district to the presidency of the Pueblo School Board. This means she was in Pueblo County in 1893 when women achieved the elective franchise by popular referendum on November 7th. I bet Holly, who had worked for suffrage in New York City, was happy with the move to Colorado on that day. It was not until December 4th when the governor made the proclamation that women's suffrage became the law in Colorado. And it took a few days for the registration documents to make their way to county clerks around the state. On Thursday, December 7th, the first woman in Pueblo County registered to vote. The first women in Pueblo County registered to vote. Julia Sisson and Joanna Sperry, whose image we actually have in the courthouse, in the old courthouse in Pueblo today. On Monday, December 11th, more women registered, including the first Black women in Pueblo County to register to vote, Lulu Lincoln and Eudora Logan. In trying to balance out the unfair history of the past, we tend to overstate the issues around voting and race. And we know that Black women in Pueblo were active in the suffrage movement and also that they registered to vote. So don't let anyone tell you Black women couldn't vote. Also, don't let anyone tell you it's a simple story, because it's not. But that's a story for another day and possibly another speaker. Today, I want to focus again on Carrie Clyde Holly. It took women's groups in Pueblo and throughout Colorado no time at all to transition from working for suffrage to working to be educated voters, and in fact, working to elect women to office. In September 1894, the Pueblo County Republican Convention met. According to the Chieftain, our local newspaper, one of them, the convention met in the morning at the courthouse, you see pictured here, but the accommodations at that place were entirely inadequate, and adjournment was taken to the Columbia Theater. Remember, there are twice as many voters in 1894 as there had been in 1893 when women couldn't vote. According to the Chieftain again, there were many lady delegates in the convention. The chair asked for nominations for representative to the Colorado State House and was gratified that there were 16 nominations for 4 positions. Among them was Mrs. Carrie C. Holly. She received more votes than any other nominee for representative. The Chieftain article goes on. Mrs. Holly appeared on the platform escorted by Mayor Straight, and the convention went fairly wild. And my sound didn't work on the slide, so you have to applaud yourself. Yay! Okay, so everyone was very excited about the nomination of a woman, and I think they liked Holly herself too. So the convention went fairly wild when she got up on the stage. She made, and again I'm quoting, a neat little speech in accepting the office. It had to be neat and little because women are neat little people. Just like Ocasio-Cortez's speech just the other day had to be fiery, according to ABC News, because she is a woman and a Latina. So in her neat little speech in accepting office, Carrie Clyde Holly thanked the convention for the honor shown to women and said that she would do everything in her power to redeem the state from populist misrule. At that time, the Populist Party was powerful in Colorado. There were still Republicans and Democrats, but the Populists had taken control of the state previously, the government of the state previously. But the Chieftain was a Republican paper, and Holly was a Republican candidate. Well, let me go back just one here. Okay. So, in the sketches of the nominees that were published in the newspaper, we read about Holly that she came from New York a while ago. She lives with her husband. She has 2 daughters. And the last 2 sentences, I think, are important. Mrs. Holly is a very pleasant, womanly lady with a sweet voice and attractive personality who will win votes wherever she appears. She has hosts of friends who will work hard for her. Well, this is lovely, but she was also president of the school board, and that is not mentioned in her convention, although with the male candidates, previous political activity was mentioned. So it's very striking to read Holly's story alongside, or Holly's sketch alongside the sketch of the men who are running for office, because she is identified by her pleasantness, and the help of her friends is going to get her elected, as opposed to she's a really competent person who should be representative. Okay, so she, in her campaign in 1894, she argued for a little bit about suffrage. She didn't have to argue in favor of suffrage, but she argued about the importance of suffrage. In her first campaign speech in early October, campaigns were blissfully shorter then. In her first campaign speech, she said she thought the clause in the Declaration of Independence, which said all men are created equal, included her sex as well as men. She also wanted to pay her respects to the Western men, every one of whom showed in every way his respect for women. The chance that every one of them showed in every way their respect for women by the vote for suffrage is maybe a little bit inaccurate, especially in Pueblo, where suffrage did not in fact pass, although it passed in the entire state of Colorado. And so those Pueblo men had to live with it. But she talked about women's suffrage and the importance of women voting as part of her campaign activities. So she also spoke a great deal about the Republican Party, and she actually credits the Republican Party correctly with bringing about the abolition of slavery and all other great reforms, according to Holly, and credits it with being the party that originated the equal suffrage movement in the state and made it possible for the question to be brought before the women. This is a point of some contention, actually, because the Republican Party was the most powerful party when the state was created. And when the state was created, the Constitution was written in such a way that made it easier for women to gain the elective franchise in Colorado than it was in almost any other state. But the populists had worked very hard in 1893 on the campaign. And so they were quite bitter when Republicans swept the whole state and fairly beyond the state in 1894, because they had thought the women owed them, and the women voted the way they wanted to vote. The women are very annoying that way. Okay. Also, another major theme was the question of silver and how important silver coinage was. This is a very complicated story too, and I'm not going to go into details, but basically at one point, both gold and silver were the standard by which American money was measured. And it had recently changed to the gold system and then had gone back and forth. But Colorado was a very big silver mining state. And so it was not particularly contentious for any campaigner to say pro-silver, I'm pro-silver in Colorado, because it was financially beneficial to the entire state. Now, the House of Representatives in Colorado was not going to have any direct say in the question of silver. But what they did have direct say in was the election of senators. And so the pro-silver voters, the House and the Senate got to choose, the State House and Senate got to choose who the US senator was going to be, and they wanted to make sure that was a pro-silver candidate, and it was. And then she also argued in her campaign speeches about the importance of the age of consent. The age of consent was part of the party platform, and I'm going to talk much more about this in a moment, so we will move on. When they got, when Holly and Clark and Cressingham got elected, the news was reported across the country. Usually actually in very small snippets, but occasionally some long stories came out talking about them and getting most things right, but not everything. 3 women will occupy seats in the next legislature of Colorado. They are Mrs. Clara Cressingham, Mrs. Carrie Clyde Holly, and Mrs. Frances Clark. Surely the world moves. This was, in fact, a revolution. We take it so much for granted now that women can hold political office. But this was a revolution. And every revolution needs a hat. Okay, so when Holly, in fact, in Holly's first campaign speech, I quoted parts of above, she also was kind of complaining about how she was treated when she campaigned for office. I have noticed among the warmest friends of equal suffrage a feeling of uneasiness as to the advisability of electing a woman to office. They seem to think the women would legislate themselves a large collection of bonnets or some equally foolish measure. But, oops, we'll go back there in just a second. So ironically, what happened when they got elected is one of the first things that the women worked out was what to do with their hats. So bonnets, in fact, was an issue, although not a legislative one. The rules of the General Assembly of Colorado required legislators to remove their hats. While it was customary for men to remove their hats indoors, it was not customary for women. And so the women talked among themselves, trying to figure out what the best plan would be, what to do with their hats. And they decided to wear their hats into the room, but take them off and place them on the desks. And so I just found it humorous that they were making jokes about hats, and then that actually had to be a decision that the women made. So Holly actually writes a report of how she passed her legislation, and that gets published, and I will show you that in a little while. But in this report, she talks about her feelings when she is in the assembly. By the way, you will notice, and that's on purpose, that while that is Carrie Clyde Holly's head in the picture, it is not Carrie Clyde Holly's body. I stuck somebody else's body on the image from the Getty, and because I wanted to show her seated, but as you know, there are very few pictures. Unused to taking part in legislative or any other public assembly, I felt no small embarrassment in seating myself with only 2 others of my sex among 62 men in the 10th General Assembly of the state of Colorado, which commenced its regular session on the 2nd day of January, 1895, being the first to meet in its new, magnificent $2 million Capitol. The Capitol had been completed in November of 1894, so they were the first ones who got to use it, so that was exciting too. So Carrie Clyde Holly seems a little bit uncomfortable, in her own words, with stepping onto the floor of the House and with writing and passing legislation. Give me a second here because I lost my page, and I will be there in a moment. So, however uncomfortable she might have been, she also stood up for herself in the face of opposition, which was going to be necessary for passing legislation, but really she does it from day one. On January 2nd, 1895, for the first time ever, 3 women entered a state capitol building as legislators. It was customary for male members to present their wives on the floor of the House, but Carrie Clyde Holly was stopped at the door by the sergeant at arms, who said that the members of her family must sit elsewhere. She promptly demanded by what right, and this is a quote from the Akron Daily Democrat in Akron, Ohio, by what right several men were allowed to present their wives on the floor if she could not introduce her husband. According to the Akron Daily Democrat, the doorkeeper succumbed helplessly. That was her first victory. That was reported as her first victory in various newspapers around the country. Let's turn now to her legislation. I want to start with the one piece of legislation that passed, her age of consent bill, that became known across the country as the Holly Bill. Before we look at what she had to do to get it passed, let's consider why she might have wanted to pass it and how it was perceived as beneficial to women. Age of consent is basically statutory rape. According to Holly's original bill, and the wording is here, the age at which women should be able to choose to have sex with a man was 21. If a man had sex with a female under 21 years of age, he would be guilty of rape and would be punished. When I first started conducting research on Holly, being an expert on ancient Rome and not 19th century America, I wondered how being a suffragist and then being one of the first women elected to a legislature could be reconciled with a bill that seemed to take authority from a young woman to infantilize her, and this seemed like reactionary legislation to me. So I began to study the age of consent issue in the 19th century, and things began to fall into place. On this slide, you're going to see, or you already see, yellow outlines are my primary sources, and the black outlines are secondary sources, or what I sometimes refer to as modern scholarship. Among the primary sources is the journal I mentioned before. Holly actually wrote about how she got her law passed in the Arena, in a magazine on the Arena that was running a whole year year-long series on age of consent. And so Holly wrote for part of that. So why age of consent legislation? Why is that important? I'm gonna go back in time now, not all the way to the Romans, don't worry. The Industrial Revolution began in the late 1700s. It brought with it the proliferation of cities. This meant that women who used to be working in their home or farm under the watchful eye of parents and relatives were now in the big, scary city. The purity movement wanted to protect young women from the dangers of urban life. One significant danger was generally envisioned as older men seducing younger, usually white, innocent women. If their families could not protect them, it would be the job of the government to make sure they were protected. These ideas led to dramatic action when women realized that in America, the age of consent was, in many places, Colorado included, 10 years old. This meant if you were 11 and you had sex with a man, that was considered consensual. Even before women could vote in Colorado, they organized, mostly under the auspices of the WCTU, that is the Women's Christian Temperance Union. They organized to raise the age of consent in Colorado. The Colorado WCTU was right on board with the efforts of the national WCTU. This was a massive countrywide movement. And the Colorado branch successfully petitioned the legislature in 1891 to raise the age of consent from 10 to 16. But that was not enough for Holly, for the women of the WCTU, or for the Republican Party. The Republican platform in 1894 included what Cressingham called sentimental legislation. That is legislation looking after women. So the Republican Party platform was to raise the age of consent to 21. So when Holly was trying to pass her laws, she was doing it in conjunction with the Republican platform. And the Republican platform is probably that way because of the influence of women on that platform in 1894. We'll come back to Colorado, but we still have to reconcile the age of consent with women's suffrage. As J. Shoshana Ehrlich points out in her book, Regulating Desire, the women of the purity reform movement asserted female political power even before women achieved the right to vote and hold office. Thus, the purity movement was both a moral movement and an assertion of female political power. It was both a broad frontal attack on male sexual privilege and an assertion by women that laws were not objective, that women had the right to legal recognition, and that they had the right to petition legislators. Ehrlich points out that among the female reformers, because there were male and female reformers in the purity movements of the 19th century, but among female reformers, there's a deep distrust of and anger toward male sexual privilege infused in the crusade. So, back to Holly. Not surprisingly, perhaps, when her colleagues argued that men and women should be treated equally in her law, Holly's arguments about the sexual double standard were more or less ignored by her colleagues. The sexual standard was the privilege that men had to be sexually free and even encouraged and praised for sexual promiscuity. But in the meantime, women, and especially according to Holly, were ruined by this. The men in both the House and the Senate in Colorado, both those who supported the bill and those who opposed it, were concerned about another issue with Holly's law, and that was the evil women blackmailing the poor, unsuspecting men. What if you did not know that the prostitute you were going to visit was younger than 21? This was a big piece of the argument in both houses. Holly replied basically that it was not easy to convict a man of rape. Plus, the judge and jury have discretion since the punishment is anywhere from 1 to 20 years, in the penitentiary. So she was not concerned that blackmail would be an issue, but the men were very much concerned about what would happen to them if they had sex with a young woman or girl who would then accuse them, trick them into having sex with them and then accuse them. And that was a big piece of their argument. So let's take a look at how this plays out. Like, what does it look like for Holly? Again, these are not real pictures, but you get the idea. It's January 23. Holly had worked hard to get her bill taken out of order. It made a special order of business, which meant that they would deal with it in advance of other orders on the docket. All the galleries in the House of the Representatives, and this is from the Pueblo Chieftain on January 24th, all the galleries in the House of the Representatives were crowded at 11 o'clock when Mrs. Holly's bill to raise the age of consent from 16 to 21 years was made the special order of business. Women were everywhere. They packed the space railed off for them. They made an almost solid line around the 3 sides of the house on which extended the galleries set apart for men. They occupied chairs beside the members or sat in the aisles. They even knelt on the floor near Mrs. Clock, Mrs. Cressingham, and Mrs. Holly. Members of the Equal Suffrage Association were present by the score. The WCTU, the Women's Club, and many other organizations were represented. Most of the women were middle-aged or elderly, but there was a good sprinkling of girls. At times, the enthusiasm from members championing the bill was expressed in the most demonstrative fashion. Hands were clapped, handkerchiefs were waved, and kid-gloved fists were pounded upon the balcony balustrade. One woman was so carried away with interest in the heated debate that she dropped her purse, which happened not to be heavy with silver dollars, right on Speaker Humphrey's head. This was a novel moment in the history of the United States. It was the first time a bill promulgated by a woman came before a state legislature. The women in the galleries and aisles and on the floor were not only there because they supported the bill, they were also there because one of their own was going to legislate, and most, if not all, of the women present had worked hard to make this kind of moment possible. Holly's bill passed in the Senate, despite her colleague Frank Ali from Pueblo, who thought, it is all out of place in this body to have a woman make law. The Senate, on the other hand, was incredibly resistant to the bill, and Holly had a heck of a time getting anyone to champion the bill in the Senate. Instead, she is met with ridicule, obstructionism, and language so offensive she was unwilling to repeat it. The women in the galleries had to leave the Senate chamber in disgust while the male senators were having the conversation, or basically an insult party. Nevertheless, finally, an altered version appeared in the Senate, and the bill was returned to the House on nearly the last day of the legislature. So remember, back in January, Holly had gone out of her way to say, this is really urgent, we need to deal with it quickly. And so in January, toward the end of January, it ended up in the Senate. The Senate held onto it and didn't do anything with it until the end of March. And the last day of the session was April 1st. So they really were trying to not pass the bill, but also to not deal with it directly. So, but finally, an altered version does appear in the Senate, and the bill was returned to the House, but the House members could not agree on the amendments that the Senate made. And so what happens is the two chambers get together and they set up a committee. So 5 House of Representatives members and 5 senators got together and tried to hash out the bill. Holly was on this committee. They could not agree. She was not willing to give up the age of 21. And so then that committee was dissolved and they formed another committee, and that committee agreed, but not placing the age of women at 21, but placing the age of women at 18. And so, although Holly was disappointed at the low age of 18, she was all ready for her bill to become a law in Colorado. She really thought she was in the clear since there was a Republican governor and he had already expressed support. And then she read in a few newspapers that he was considering not signing the bill. If he didn't sign it by the end of April, then it would be vetoed by default. So she wrote to him at length from her sick bed. She would have gone, but she was ill. And she persuaded him to sign it. And on April 22nd at 11:45 a.m. in 1895, the first bill promulgated by a woman from an official seat in the state legislature became law. Let's talk a little bit about Holly's legislative agenda. It was extensive. Details of the proposed laws are recorded in the House Journal and Senate Journal only if they are passed. And even then, sometimes, you get the whole thing somewhere else. So we don't know about all of these bills, but we know the topics of all of these bills. So she proposed 14. Some of them are duplicates, which is why your numbers don't add up to 14. 3 were additional morality bills, punishing as a crime seduction, enticing of males or females into houses of bad repute, and enticing unmarried females into dance houses. I guess you could entice married females into dance houses if you want. 3 were connected with education, providing for examination of teachers, punishing truancy, and the details of the others are unknown. 3 were concerning women's rights within the family, inheritance, divorce, and alimony, and rights with regard to custody of children. 1 was about advancing cases to the Colorado Supreme Court, and 1 was about imposing an educational qualification on voters. The final bill Holly introduced was a bill for an act to grant and extend to female citizens of the state all the civil rights, privileges, and immunities which are now or may hereafter be granted or extended to male citizens, and to repeal all laws or parts of laws inconsistent with this act. So 38 years before Alice Paul first proposed the Equal Rights Amendment to the US Congress, Carrie Clyde Holly introduced a law granting equal rights to women in Colorado. The bill was tabled allegedly due to lack of time to discuss it. If you think this is not a big deal, you might consider that finally, a few weeks ago, the final state necessary ratified Alice Paul's Equal Rights Amendment. So that Holly's already calling for it in a law in 1895 is in fact quite significant. She was really interested in suffrage, and even after Colorado women got the vote, she continued to promote suffrage. So she passes a resolution in the House. It's supposed to be a House and Senate joint resolution, but she passes it in the House to get, to congratulate California and New York on their opportunity to vote for suffrage. But in the Senate, it was buried in a committee of literary lights. And we never saw it again until this spring when, following a petition that was drafted by the Women's Suffrage Centennial of Southern Colorado, the House and Senate honored Carrie Clyde Holly and the House Joint Resolution 21. Holly became famous not only for the content of her law, but for the fact that a woman was capable of passing a law. I really liked this because this has sort of been my experience of Holly, even though in some ways I think she's really exceptional. My experience is what the indicator says. Mrs. Holly is human. In being human, she erred in some things while in the legislature. But taken all in all, she made the best representative Pueblo had in the General Assembly. She showed that she was bright enough to learn, honest enough to stand for principle, and independent enough and courageous enough to take a broad view of questions in spite of the party lash. So her year in office was a success. She did not run again, but she did become a lawyer. She was the first woman in Pueblo County to do that. And we have reports of a couple of her cases in the newspaper. One where she was defending someone against a slander of having stolen her neighbor's turkey. And another, so she was successful in the slander case. There was another where she was defending a man who shot the husband of the woman in whose bed he was lying with her. And so that was supposed to be self-defense, but that guy did not get off. So it's a mixed bag of success, or maybe that is successful, I don't know. But so she practiced law in Colorado, in Pueblo. She wrote letters to the National American Women's Suffrage Association, supporting suffrage. She joined the Silver Republican Party. She ran for superintendent of schools, but she got very disappointed in the Republican Party because of the silver issue. And so she ran as a Democrat in 1901. And then she also was seen as a precinct captain in 1912. And also in 1912, she's in Kansas, helping what turns out to be the successful campaign in Kansas for women's suffrage. So she's still very politically active, and there are lots of other things besides this that she's engaged in. Who lives, who dies, who tells your story? So, of course, for Hamilton, the answer was Eliza and then Lin-Manuel Miranda. For Carrie Clyde Holly, I wanted to talk a little bit about why we don't know her story, because I think that is important. First of all, her first husband died in 1901. Her second husband, it was not a very happy marriage, and they were divorced after a few years, 6 or 7 years. And then Emily, her daughter, predeceased her, died in 1933 after Emily's second marriage. And Helen did outlive her, and in fact did try to tell her story in a way. Holly always wanted to be a writer, and Helen published a book posthumously that was written, actually there's a part of it is written by her sister Emily, a part of it by herself, and then the bulk of it is a fictional story written by Carrie Clyde Holly, The Lawyer and the Tramp. And so, but neither Emily nor Helen had any children. So Holly has no living descendants around to tell her story. The other reason is as we say in Latin, cui bono, to whose good is the telling of the story? Who benefits? The anti-suffragists would not have benefited. They do recognize Holly, and they say, well, she passed a law, but it ends up being statements like, well, one woman got around to passing a law, but the rest of them, there's no way there ever going to be women in political power again, and blah, blah, blah. So the anti-suffragists were actively downplaying her, but the pro-suffragists too, in certain ways, downplayed her. They did celebrate the passing of the law and her election and her ability to pass the law, but they also wanted to ease the minds of men who are on the fence about promoting suffrage for women. And so if you told them, look how great it is, a woman will become a legislator, then they're more hesitant to say, okay, let's give her the vote. So the story of the legislators was less important for the suffragists than we want everyone to get the right to vote. In Colorado, it's working out just fine, but they don't want to talk very much about legislators. And finally, there is this massive wave, right, that Holly is writing that we can argue starts in 1848 with Elizabeth Cady Stanton reading the Declaration of Sentiments at Seneca Falls. But Carrie's really riding this wave, and by the late 19th century, it's sort of getting really big, and so she's on the crest of it. So it's not just Carrie Clyde Holly who's changing the world, but women across the entire country are taking on tasks that are new to women, and they are working very hard for suffrage. And so there are many, many, many names that we do not know. But for Carrie Clyde Holly, now at least, a few people know her name. And we can take pride as a state that we had the first woman legislator anywhere in the country. And Pueblo can take pride as a county that we provided the first woman who ever served as a legislator and passed legislation anywhere in the entire country, maybe in the entire world. Surely the world moved, and Carrie Clyde Holly was there when it did. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Judy Gaughan. It's so amazing to hear about Carrie Clyde Holly, and it's really awesome. She was the representative here and maybe the first in the world. One of the first questions that I have is that thought about the world. What places might be in the thought of the first representatives in legislature for
in
this?
Contention. So, so the country of New Zealand is actually the first place in the world to give women the right to vote. And that was a few months before it happened in Colorado in 1893. But there are also, I mean, really changes happening across the world. In India, women are starting to agitate for rights around the same time. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, there's a woman from Japan whose photo I saw just the other day. It's a little bit later, right? It's 1910 or 1911, but she's here in a suffrage parade in the United States, but she's representing the Japanese pro-woman suffrage movement. And of course, most famously, I think, at least in this country, besides us, are people like Amelia Pankhurst in the United Kingdom, right, who are also moving for suffrage. And when Colorado women get the right to vote, I found a pamphlet, I think it was in the Denver Public Library, although I'd have to see which archive it was. Might have been somewhere else. But anyway, it is a statement about how great suffrage is in Colorado, and it's translated into French for the French Women's Suffrage Organization. So the world.
Wow, it's just such a complex history and all this thought. Another question I have here is from Iris. It says, in your research, did you come across any mention of the Wednesday Morning Club or Thatcher Lady Chautauqua? And then she says the group is still meeting today in Pueblo.
I did not know that the Thatcher group was still meeting. I have come across them, and I have a couple of their names in a different file somewhere. I focused mostly in the work that I've done so far, I focused mostly on those groups that were directly political and very much that way, but the women's clubs in Pueblo, they're all over the place. They're all over the country. They're also all over the place in Pueblo. So I did see some of those other groups. And Holly herself is a member of the Clio Club in Pueblo as well. So
awesome. And then to lead into a couple of questions, and then we'll settle up here. Now, Richard says several of Holly's initiatives seem to be linked to moral issues that haven't really stood the test of time. Do you think that has played a part in her lack of recognition, perhaps especially from post-Prohibition?
That is an interesting point. So her bill gets superseded, and the law in Colorado gets superseded, I think as early as 1910. I have to double check the exact date. And so it might be that because the law itself did not, as you say, stand the test of time, that may actually have contributed to it. And I hadn't thought about that, so thank you. Well considered.
And then from Luis, I have, was prostitution illegal at the time? If it was, then wouldn't that render the argument of men being tricked by underage prostitutes moot?
You know what? Really should know the answer to that, Louise, but I don't know about the legality of prostitution. I know it was pervasive, but if it is illegal, it's not, if you have sex with a prostitute, it's not considered rape. So you're not going to go to prison for up to 20 years for having sex with a prostitute, unless she's under 21, well, under 18.
All right. Now, Patricia asked, what does her story have to contribute to contemporary women's political work?
Well, I think, like I said, that she is, the work that she's doing, we're still trying to do. We can't even pass the Equal Rights Amendment, for goodness sake. And she, and she wrote what was basically an Equal Rights Amendment. She wrote a bill that was basically an Equal Rights Amendment for Colorado. And also, I think that we can all stand up and do work to improve our country, and like Holly was trying to do. And even if now today we might laugh at her law and see it as problematic, what she did was she said, I'm going to make this country a better place, and one way to do it is to make it morally pure. For us, we might be not interested in that question of moral purity in the same way, but we are certainly interested in, let us improve our country, let us make our country better. And I think many of the people in this audience are very active in doing that. So you're all doing a good job following the footsteps of Carrie Clyde Holly.
Awesome. All right, so just a couple more questions here. Carol asked, since 1900, has Colorado had women in the legislature in most sessions? Is that something you know?
Yeah, I have not looked entirely through the whole thing. So I don't know that for sure the answer to that. It's actually, I think on Wikipedia, there's a list of all the women who have been in the House and Senate. So I think the answer is yes, in most sessions that there has been at least one woman. And of course, recently, a whole great lot of women.
Right, right. All right. Now, I like this question, and if we have any others, please email me and we can do our best to get those out. But I love this question. What have you found most inspiring about your research on Carrie Clyde Holly?
Oh, goodness. This is not the right answer, but this is the answer. Working with the women I've been working with to celebrate suffrage in Southern Colorado. And frankly, across the state, but I've been working more closely with the people in Southern Colorado, and that women are just friggin' awesome. And not that we're perfect, but that we work really hard to make the world a better place. And so the thing that has inspired me most is the enthusiasm of the Women's Suffrage Centennial Southern Colorado group, and the enthusiasm in other people in learning about what we have discovered. And I'm not the only one doing research in our group. So there's lots out there. And we have a webpage. So the Women's Suffrage Centennial Southern Colorado webpage has a lot of primary sources available if people are interested.
Awesome. Yeah, we'll share that in the chat here as well. Again, for the sake of time and respecting everyone's time here, any questions that you'd like me to forward to Dr. Judy Gaughan, just send them to me, the email that you got the invite from, and I would be happy to inquire with Judy to see if your question cannot be answered or can be answered. Yeah. So thank you so much, Judy. We're just going to go over a couple of our next programs here, but this has been so enlightening to hear about Carrie Clyde Holly and Colorado early legislature. Now, Judy, you frequented a lot of these, so I'm so glad that you, Bobley, will join us here. You may know that many national known suffragists, or at least some, did visit Colorado in their kind of state push for suffrage. We're going to learn about Susan B. Anthony with Karen Drops, and that'll be our next one in 2 weeks on August 8th. You'll find information about that in the chat. But then to finalize this series, and we'll come back again soon, the Colorado Women Lecture Series will finalize this one on suffrage with More Than Votes, the women's suffrage movement in Colorado and the nation. So we will have 3 of our local historians on women's history, Gail Beaton, Marsha Goldstein, and Rebecca Hunt, here to really discuss what this meant for a very long time period here in Colorado. But like anything, please do help us support our programs on our House Museum by following the link here. You'll also find information about Colorado State University Pueblo's history program in a link in the chat, as well as that link again into the Women's Votes and Women's Suffrage Centennial Southern Colorado as well. So again, thank you all so much for joining us. Dr. Judy Gaughan, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful, informative presentation. Any last words before we end?
Go out and be active and save the world.
I love that. I love that. Well, you all get to it. You got a nice mission from Dr. Judy Gaughan, and we will see you in 2 weeks. Feel free to email me those questions. Look forward to a follow-up email, and a lot of you in the original email should see the link to our current YouTube page, and they'll eventually be on the History Colorado's page as well. All right, you all have a wonderful weekend. Stay dry out there, and you have a wonderful day, Judy.
Thank you. Good night. Bye, everyone.